Now, one very important topic to discuss is mass extinction. Now, as the words itself will suggest you, you have two words here, mass and extinction. The meaning of extinction is something that we have already discussed. And when you talk about mass extinction, you know that mass is something which is happening at a very large scale. So, a kind of extinction that happens at a very large scale can be called as a mass extinction. Now, when we talk about mass extinction, if you go into the history, geological history of the earth, you will find out that there have been 5 occurrences of mass extinctions in the world. So there are 5 extinctions where we have seen that there have been huge drop in the species number, huge drop in the different kinds of species that we have had on the earth. So what are these 5 events that we have to discuss? Now, probably these 5 extinctions are not going to be very important for your examination. The most important point here is the 6th extinction. So there is the 6th mass extinction that we talk about, and this is what is going to be important. And there has already been a question in 2018 prelims that was asked on 6th mass extinction, just the meaning of 6th mass extinction. So you have to understand that one simple question, direct question on the definition of 6th mass extinction has been asked. If UPSC has to ask a question on this topic in the coming years, it can either be your prelims examination or the mains examination. In any case, what we might see is a little tougher question. For example, they can ask you what are the evidences that suggest that there is a mass extinction, or what have been the effects on different kinds of species of the world due to current mass extinction. What is the reason behind it? There could be many things that can be comprehended from here. So first thing is, let's have a discussion on what are the different mass extinctions that we have seen until now. The first one that we saw is called as Ordovician mass extinction. So when you talk about Ordovician, you have to remember that these are various periods on the geological time scale of the world. These are various periods. Now, when we talk about the periods, the ages, all these kind of things are not important for the examination. For someone who is studying geography optional, they might see these things, but you just need to understand that these were some periods where these mass extinctions happened. So first of all, when we talk about the Ordovician mass extinction, it happened approximately 440 to 450 million years ago. Apart from that, the size of extinction could have been between 60 to 70%. That is 60 to 70% of all the living organisms that existed at that point of time, they got extinct. Now, talking about the suspected cause or the causes of the first mass extinction, very recent reports that were published in June of 2020, these reports say that the main cause behind the first mass extinction would have been volcanism and anoxia, which would have led to the warming of the earth, and ultimately the first mass extinction was observed. If you look at the earlier reports, the earlier studies had suggested that there might have been cooling of the earth that happened, glaciation happened, and that led to the first mass extinction. But if these reports are to be believed, then in that case, volcanism, warming and anoxia are given as the reasons for the first mass extinction. Now, the second mass extinction is called as Devonian mass extinction. It might have happened 375 million years ago. Apart from that, more than 70% of all the living things were wiped out at this point of time. Then, now when you talk about the suspected cause or the causes, lack of oxygen in the oceans, quick cooling of air temperatures, possible volcanic eruptions, and one more theory also says that there could have been another meteorite strike at that point of time which might have wiped out the species living at that point of time. So these are few of the reasons that are given, but many of the evidences suggest that this might not have been very quick, because if it was about a meteor shower, that is a meteorite strike on the earth, perhaps it would have been very fast. But what we have seen is some of the evidences suggest that this might have taken more than 10 million years to happen. So 10 million years means that it is a very long time period that we are looking at, and something like the meteorite strike perhaps may not be the whole and sole reason for it. Maybe it is one of the reasons, maybe it is a combination of reasons that led to the second mass extinction. So these are some of the theories with respect to second mass extinction. Then you have the third one, which would have happened approximately 250 million years ago. Approximately 96% of all the species living on the earth at that point of time would have died. Also been named as the Great Dying. So when we talk about the suspected causes, it could have been a possible asteroid strike, volcanic activity. Now, this volcanic activity that we are talking about, this perhaps continued for approximately 1 million years. And because it continued for such a long period of time, the oxygen supply was cut off, a lot of acid rain started to happen, and at the same time, we also say that climate change might have happened. Then, after that, we have the fourth mass extinction. It might have happened approximately 200 million years ago. Size of extinction, we say that approximately more than half of the species, that is approximately 50% of the species, might have been vanished at that point of time. The major suspected cause is again volcanic activity, then the climate change that was seen because of that, and there was a change in pH and the sea levels of the oceans that was observed. And because of that also, many of the new adaptations that the species might have to come across, they were not able to survive that. So that became the reason for the fourth mass extinction. And then we have the fifth mass extinction, which is also called as the KT mass extinction sometimes. So when we talk about this might have happened approximately 65 million years ago. The size of extinction, approximately 75% of all the known species were vanished. And then the most accepted theory for the cause is the meteorite impact that might have happened at that point of time. And this is where dinosaurs cease to exist. Basically, we say that the age of reptiles was over, because reptiles used to dominate the earth at this point of time. But because of the meteorite impact, the fifth mass extinction happened, and majority of the reptiles that used to rule the earth at that point of time, they were also wiped out. So this is about the 5 mass extinctions. Maybe not very important for the examination, but you should just know about it. Now there is one very interesting species that we know about, and this is tardigrade. When we talk about tardigrade, why it becomes so important in this context is that it is supposed to be the only organism that might have outlived all the 5 major extinctions. All the 5 mass extinctions that happened, it has outlived all those, and it is the only such organisms which we know of that might have lived through all these. So what makes it so special? It is something which is also termed as extremophile sometimes, meaning that it can live in conditions which are very extreme. For example, it can survive in temperatures which are as low as minus 200 degrees Celsius. Not only this, it can survive without food and water for more than hundreds of years, and that too without any seemingly discomfort being observed. So that's why this is an organism that has been able to outlive all the mass extinctions. Not only this, the theories also say that the sixth mass extinction perhaps also would be outlived by this organism. So when we talk about these kind of organisms, there is another such organism that we talk about, and that is a cockroach. So you might have read about this somewhere. If not, you can Google it. Cockroach is also supposed to be one organism that perhaps also might survive any of the extreme conditions. Some scientists even suggest that even in case of a holocaust, it might be able to survive. But when it comes to tardigrade, it has already proven so. It may be the only organism again that might be able to survive very easily. Now we come to a very, very important topic. And this is a topic that concerns us very deeply today. We are looking at another mass extinction. Until now, we have seen various reasons: volcanic eruptions, climate change, continental drift, the meteorite strike. In case of the meteorite strike, you can say it's an accident. But the thing that we are looking at today, the sixth mass extinction as we call it, this is something which is human induced. This is something which is anthropogenic in nature. Why? Because this is something that has happened because of our actions. This is something that has happened because of the way we have been trying to modify and change the environment, how we have been playing with the nature. And because of that, we have seen that there is another mass extinction that we are looking at. And this is a mass extinction which is very, very fast. Because if you look at all the other mass extinction, all these extinctions have been slow in process. For example, we talk about the continental drift. And continental drift is not something that happened in, let's say, even 100 years or thousands of years. It might have taken a million years for such a thing to happen. Similarly, when we talk about the volcanic eruptions kept on happening for a million years or more. And that led to the mass extinction that happened at that point of time. So all these are the reasons which took a lot of time. Although we say mass extinction, but the time period that we are looking at is perhaps 10 to 20 million years of time. But this mass extinction that we are talking about, the sixth mass extinction, This is not taking that much time. We are just talking about a few hundred years that has led to the sixth mass extinction. And today there are many such clues that point us towards the sixth mass extinction. If you look at the data collected and the researches done by various organizations, for example IUCN, you will see that they have observed drastic falls in various species. Whether you talk about the amphibians that we discussed, or you talk about the reptiles, you talk about the mammals, you talk about the birds, you talk about vertebrates in general, you'll find that all these organisms have been drastically affected by this mass extinction. And many of the studies have suggested that there are a lot of such species that have lost more than 80% of its population, or at least it has lost complete of its ecosystem and it is not going to survive for long. And that is something that we have also discussed in case of the amphibians, that there has been a mass extinction of amphibians which has been happening just in the last 50 years. All the other mass extinctions, we are talking about millions of years. Here we are talking about a set of only a few hundred years. So perhaps we can say that until the industrial revolution started, there was nothing as such that was happening. I mean, extinctions were happening, extinctions will keep on happening, but these are extinctions which are actually called as background extinctions. They are called as background extinctions. So background extinctions will always keep on happening. The older species which are not able to survive anymore will be replaced by new species, will be replaced by better species, will be replaced by better adaptable species. But that is not something which is happening here. We are talking about the mass extinction, where the things are changing so fast. Whether you talk about the habitat destruction, you talk about climate change, you talk about pollution, all these things are happening so fast that all these organisms have not been able to survive. And that's why something which is so sensitive, as we discussed about the amphibians, they will definitely not survive. So that has been the case in last few hundred years. So if we look at some of the data in the past 500 years, we know that approximately 1000 species have gone extinct. The IUCN has assessed roughly 3% of the described species and identified 16,928 species worldwide as being threatened with extinction, or roughly 38% of those assessed. So 38% of the things of the species that were assessed, they found that it has been threatened with extinction, and there are high chances that these species might go extinct. So what we'll do now is that we'll look at the facts related to some of the other species, and it is here that we need to understand that what is the effect of this mass extinction that is happening on various species of organisms, where we'll look at some of the data with respect to all these species and try to understand what kind of laws they are looking at and what kind of effects it might have for the coming future. Now, with respect to the sixth mass extinction, what we have observed is that there are certain data that become very, very important for us. And if you look at the various categories of species, for example, mammals, birds, amphibians, etc., you'll realize that there has been a drastic drop in the number of species that exist and the number of individuals in each of the species that are present today. So, for example, if we look at the population of species that have less than 1000 individuals, out of that, if we just consider mammals, approximately 70% of them have number of individuals which is even less than 250. So number of such species which have number of individuals less than 250 is the highest, that is approximately 70%. Similarly, even if you look at the birds, it is close to say 50%. In case of reptiles, close to 60%. In case of amphibians, it is 70%. And then for the entire vertebrates, we have in the range of 50-55%. So what we are looking at is, especially for mammals and for amphibians, and more so for amphibians, that there has been a constant decline in the population, and there are a lot of such species which today have less than 1000 individuals. And even in this category of less than 1000 individuals, there are so many such species which have just less than 250 individuals, which is very, very worrisome. Now, apart from this, there is another something that has been seen. So, for example, if you look at all the extinctions that have happened since 1500 AD, in that case, what we observe is that until 1800s, there is no significant change that we see, and we see that it's okay. I mean, there hasn't been much of a difference due to human activities. But all of a sudden, what we are looking at after 1800s, and that's why we say that industrial revolution had a great role to play in this. most of the data for even for climate change, when we observe, we try to take the era of industrial revolution as a base and try to compare the things before that and the things after that. And we have observed in that case also that there has been a drastic change, there has been a drastic modification of the climate after industrial revolution. Something similar has been observed in case of biodiversity also, and the number of extinctions that have been observed. So what we see is that all of a sudden after 1800 you see that the extinction rates are increasing for each of the individuals, especially if you look at mammals. Just look at where they were near about 1900 and where they are at the end of the year 2018. So this is a report that was published in 2019 by IUCN, and that is where from this has been taken. Apart from that, if you look at the decline in species survival since 1980, what we have observed is that corals have been hugely affected. Although amphibians have been affected, mammals have been affected, birds haven't been much affected, but corals have been drastically affected. We see that in case of corals, all of a sudden, from approximately 97 98, we look at a great decline of population. And this decline actually also is attributed to the El Nino phenomena that was very significant in 1998. And that's where we saw that all of a sudden the change started to happen. But climate change, ocean acidification, the rise in the temperatures of oceans, all these had to play a very, very big role in the decline in population that we have observed for the corals. Now, when we are talking about these, what we also have to observe are certain terms, and these started to happen. But climate change, ocean acidification, the rise in the temperatures of oceans, all these had to play a very, very big role in the decline in population that we have observed for the corals. Now, when we are talking about these, what we also have to observe are certain terms, and these terms are related to certain kinds of species. So there are certain terms which are used for a different kind of operation or different kind of function that a species has to play in a given environment. And there are certain terms which have been associated with all these kind of individuals. So these terms we have to understand, and these terms become important for us to understand that if we have to carry out a conservation activity, where our focus should lie and why our focus should be on certain animals and plants. So first such term that we have is a keystone species. So keystone species basically is a kind of species that will define the entire ecosystem. That is, we can very safely say that if that individual, if that species was not present in that ecosystem, then that ecosystem will collapse. So an individual which is very essential to the even survival of an ecosystem would be called as a keystone species. So there are a lot of examples. I mean, you will see that most of the examples that we normally see are predators. That is, most of the times they are carnivores. But it's not that they are only predators. For example, tiger is a big example for India. And how tiger is a big example, we'll come to it. But after that also we see not only predators but even herbivores sometimes become the keystone species. And not only herbivores, but we'll also see that in case of underwater organisms, there is a separate rule that we are following there. So in each of these cases, we have an individual which has a very, very important role to play in case of the survival of the entire ecosystem. Let's say it can be a small ecosystem, it can be a big geographical area, but nevertheless, it will be an organism that plays a central role to the survival of this ecosystem. So for example, if we talk about tigers in India have had to play a big role. So for example, let's say we talk about any of the tiger reserves or any of the forests where tigers are found. So in that case, what we know is they form a big role of the food web there. They will maintain the biodiversity, they will maintain the ecological balance of that area. So all the other animal populations will remain in control. For example, because of the presence of a tiger, you know that the herbivore population will be in check, and because herbivore population is in check, the plants, grasses, etc. can very easily survive. So that's why it plays a big role, a central role there. But we cannot stop there. Apart from that also, there are roles that it plays. For example, if you talk about any of the tiger reserves, now what happens in case of tiger reserves is that it's not that only tigers get saved, or it's not that conservation of only tiger species happen, but we leave out a big area. We leave out a big area that is enough for a tiger to survive. So when we are looking at such a big ecosystem, there will be other individuals that will come into picture. For example, there will be wolves, there will be other carnivores which are just waiting for a tiger to finish its meal so that they can start feeding upon that leftover. So they are completely dependent on a species like this. And then after that, you leave out a big area, the regeneration of the ecosystem happens in these areas. So in that case also they play a big role, because if let's say tiger was not present in a given forest or in the given ecosystem, then perhaps we would not have cared that much. And if we did not care about it, then this destruction of ecosystem that has been rampant everywhere, that would have happened to these areas also. But because there was a presence of tiger, because we wanted to conserve tigers in these areas, that became the very reason why these places were not destroyed, why these places became a very important places for conservation activity, not only for tigers, but for all the other individuals that are in one way or the other dependent on tigers, whether as their food or for their food. So this is what we have observed for tiger. Then after that, we are looking at another example of an African elephant. Now, when we talk about African elephants, what you will observe is that if you talk about the savanna grasslands that are present in these regions, for example, Tanzania can be taken as an example. If you look at these regions, why grasslands are present is also because of these elephants. Because what you observe here, the tree that you have here, this is an acacia tree. And if you talk about acacia tree is not a very big tree, but it grows very fast. But what happens is, because of the presence of elephants normally never let them grow. Either they will have it as their food when it is a small plant, or even if let's say it starts to grow, after some time it will get uprooted by one elephant or the other, and at the end they will not grow. Because if they started to grow, instead of having a savanna grassland ecosystem, you would have had a forest there, which would have acacia trees, and then after that other trees might have followed, and ultimately you might have had a forest there instead of having a grassland. So for the maintenance of grassland ecosystem itself, there is the importance of an African elephant. If African elephant was not present in this region, then in that case this grassland would have never existed. So what we are talking about a keystone species is that if the keystone species was not present, then in that case this ecosystem will not survive at all. It is important for the very survival of the ecosystem, and that's where something like an elephant also comes into the picture. Let me take a couple of more examples. One example that you have on your screen is of a shark. When we talk about the shark, the first thing probably that you think of is a kind of organism, a kind of underwater organism that is known for its attacks, something that is known for attacking the humans, killing humans, etc. But this is something that has come more from media, but rather than the facts. For example, if you just look at the facts, there are approximately 70 to 80 persons, as per some reports, who are attacked by the sharks. And if you just think of the number of people who actually die, unfortunately, is near about 6 to 8 per annum. That is, every year there are approximately 6 to 8 people who die because of shark attacks, and all over the world there have been approximately 70 to 80 people who have been attacked by the sharks, if you go by the reports. Now just look at the number of sharks that we kill. The number, I mean, if you just compare this number comes out to be 1 is to 12 lakhs. So for every human that is being killed by a shark, we are killing 12 lakh of them. So how do we say that these are the ones which are harmful for us? Rather, we are the ones who are harmful for them. So you have to understand the role that they play. And a major role that they have to play is in terms of ecosystem services. Many of the dead fish inside water are eaten up by the shark. They not only go after the fish which are live, they also go after the dead fish. And since they consume the dead fish, consume the dead organisms inside water, they play a huge role as far as ecosystem services are concerned. Because let's say sharks were absent from an area like this or wherever they are found, then what you would observe is that the number of dead and decaying fish on those kind of areas will start to increase. And that's something that is not going to be good for the environment or the survival of the ecosystem itself. So that's why you have to understand that they play a huge role. It's not only about the food web in general, but also about the role that they play in cleaning up the environment, cleaning up the underwater ecosystem. So that's why they have a very huge role to play. But unfortunately, what has been observed is that they have been hunted a lot. A lot of misinformation has been spread about them, and because of those reasons, we see that they are hunted in large numbers every year. If you look at another example, this is an example of a sea otter. And if you remember, this is an example that we have already taken. If you remember, we discussed three organisms. There were two more that we had discussed, that how removing one organism from an ecosystem plays a huge role or has a huge impact on a given ecosystem. So this is another ecosystem where this sea otter is a keystone species. And if you go by what Edward Wilson has to say about sea otters, in his book, The Diversity of Life, he writes that sea otters perhaps are the most potent of all the keystone species. Because if you remove keystone species like a sea otter from the ecosystem, in that case, the orcans start to increase in size. And because of the increase in number of the sea orcans, what will be observed is that the number of kelp will start to decrease, because it will start to feed on all the kelp. And once this happens, this is an area which will start to become like a barren land, like a desert on a land. And this is something that has been observed on the coasts of United States of America. What was observed is, when these sea otters were being hunted in large numbers, the numbers of sea orcans started to rise, which led to a decrease in sea kelp. And because of the decrease in the kelp population, these kind of areas started to become barren land. These kind of areas started to lose their ecosystem, lose their diversity. So that's why there were huge efforts that were made by the conservation biologists, so that this species of sea otters could be reintroduced into this region. And ultimately it was done, and now we started to observe that everything started to come back to normal, and it started to look like the ecosystem it used to be. So this is another example of such a keystone species. So keystone species plays a very important role, and as a concept for the examination also, it's a very important concept that you should understand. And that's why a detailed understanding of keystone species is required.